and welcome back to a very haunted Halloween edition of Stories. Today I'm talking with Daniel Cohoon. We're going to talk about the origins of Halloween. We're going to talk about spirits and ghosts and everything else. So sit back, relax, and have a spooky Halloween. See you there. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Inside the Asperger Studios Present Stories. Welcome back to a very special Halloween edition where we're going to talk about the myths and lore and everything else of Halloween and everything paranormal and everything that goes bump in the night. Please welcome my guest, Daniel Cohoon. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Hello, hello. How are you?
I am fine. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself first?
well, I am the creator of a podcast called Magical Journey. The Magical Journey brand has been around for a minute. It started out as a totally different thing on another platform, and now it's evolved into its own podcast. Uh, we have a Facebook group, a Facebook page, a website. I now own the logo and the branding for it. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. I also am a Christo pagan um, and a green witch, which a lot of people immediately their eyebrows shoot up whenever you say that. But I can explain that a little bit in as we go because it kind of ties into what today is about for some people.
I think I'm pretty familiar. When you say Greenwich, does that mean you are the those who practice the magic of the nature? Because green being with nature.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is very much based on nature and the connection with the trees, the connection with plants, rocks, the earth itself, um, life, the elements. It's all very natural based, uh, which kind of goes back into the idea that humans were created as stewards of the earth. Um, they were given dominion over the earth to protect, nurture it, and live on it. And so that's kind of how those of us that practiced Christo-pagan philosophy, view our relationship with the earth in that sense.
All right, let's get into a little bit about Halloween since we're experiencing Halloween right now, as it is the 31st of October. Where did Halloween get its origins from?
So the deepest, oldest origins of what we now call Halloween really begin as a Celtic origin. And wow, so very long ago. I mean, it's ancient, and it started out with something that eventually became known as Samhain. Uh, Samhain was essentially a lot of things. It was the end of the harvest, the end of the third harvest. It was the beginning of a new year. Uh, for those that practice the wheel of the year, it's the last spoke in the wheel before the wheel turns. And then at midnight, it turns into the new year, going into the season heading into Yule. It was a time, and to some degree, is still a time of self reflection, of the acceptance of the passing of our lives from this world to the next. It was about celebrating a long summer work and getting to slow down. And there was just so many things, and giving thanks for the abundance of the crop. That was another thing that was very important. So it was actually kind of a Thanksgiving celebration for some, in a sense. So those were some of the earlier uh, beliefs. One of the things that was really important at some point during the origin of its evolution was bonfires and lighting fires and lighting candles to represent the hope that the light would soon return, because of course we're in the dark part of the year where, especially in the northern hemisphere right now, this weekend we'll be experiencing uh, a changing of time. So it won't be dark at 6 o'clock in the morning necessarily right now, but the nights are longer, the days are shorter, and the bonfires, the candles, the lighting of the fire and tending to it all night was a representation of remembering that the return of light was coming soon, that the days would eventually start getting longer again. So there's a lot of very practical things involved with Samhain. The myths of it being, some dark, evil thing, and people, doing just vile practices and so forth. At one time, it used to be called, I remember when I was a kid, the church folks in my neighborhood would say, "Oh, that's the devil's holiday or the devil's birthday or whatever." And for years, I would question my family about that. I was like, are we, what are we doing here? Are we celebrating a holiday that we should be celebrating? Um, and, and then eventually I found out, of course, the roots of it was not as dark and evil as people seem to think it is. Um, it, Almost like comparing uh, the old ways of doing medicine to modern day medicine. Uh, you know, Not everything was about trying to use leeches to heal people.
Where did the whole myth of getting dressed up and handing out candy and saying trick or treat come from? I mean, if this was such a sacred holiday and thing, how did this whole thing of commercializing it come to be?
So there were over time the holiday, like all things, like all traditions, uh, evolved into different aspects. First of all, the dressing up in costumes. So one of the ideas or thoughts of Halloween, of Samhain, is that during this time of year, there's a thinning of the veil between the living and the dead. Like at some point, there's up here is the world of those who are no longer here, the spirit world, and here is us. And as we start descending into the darker days, there's this time point where the veil starts kind of getting to the point where it's about to meet with us. And then on Samhain, on the night of Samhain, the veil is at its thinnest, and it's the point where the ancestors can come over into our world again to visit. So with that, there was also the idea that, well, if the ancestors can come through, other spirits can come through too. So they began dressing up in costume to so that they could go out at night safely and walk among all of the spirits without being recognized as being a living creature, a human especially, so that they would just fit in and not stand out and be run the risk of being traumatized. There was another thing that happened traditionally where, and I believe they called it souling. I really have a hard time remembering the terminology altogether some days. Um, this practice was where children, especially, would go out, and the poor children, especially, would go out on Samhain and they would sing songs or um, do um, you know, chores or whatever uh, in the, I guess, to kind of trade off for food or snacks. And this became, this was for a while was a very, I guess, strong practice in a sense, because it eventually, when the Irish and the Scottish came over here as immigrants, it was something that became known amongst everybody here in the States eventually. And it turned into what we now know as trick or treat eventually. But it actually did start off with almost like acts of alms, if you will, in the old world. And there's several traditions that the Irish and the Scottish, especially the Irish, brought over here with them, like the carving of turnips and other root crops uh, into jack o' lanterns, the lore of Jack, who was this just horrible, horrible human being. Heaven nor hell wanted him, so he was cursed to walk the earth forever. Uh, and the devil, because the devil really didn't want him either, he was that bad, uh, gave him a charcoal, a coal, and gave him a turnip and put the coal in there. And that's what Jack used to light his way through the night as he was roaming the earth. So traditionally, the Irish would use turnips and so forth because there were no pumpkins in the UK to carve out the jack o' lantern, and it was to ward Jack off and let him be on his way so he would not bother and torment the people.
It's very interesting. Now, what are some of the myths that people misconsume about Halloween itself?
Well, obviously, the big one is that its origins are satanic and its origins are, dark. There's, the idea that Hollywood is created, that we have, you know, people performing black mass on Halloween and Samhain and all this, and just ridiculous amounts of stuff. And while I'm not going to say, because I don't know, maybe there are people that do that, but for the majority of people who practice Samhain and for the majority of people who celebrate Halloween, it's really more about the old ways, the traditions. Um, Now in modern times, the emphasis on giving thanks for the abundance in our lives throughout the year. Our hard work is paid off, and we have a roof over our head. We have food to eat. We're alive and we're breathing. Um, Getting having time of self-reflection. That's another thing that's part of the modern era. But there's a lot of things that you know the tales of witches flying through the sky on brooms and just ridiculous, like the whole thing with um, the story of the black cat. What a lot of people don't know about black cats, because they are considered a witch's familiar. But in Ireland, one of the reasons why cats became part of the Samhain tradition was it was believed that a black cat could come to your farm and curse it, make your cattle barren, or make your farm your fields not produce and so forth. So there were certain things, certain myths that evolved because of the lore of Scotland and Ireland. Some myths, though, a lot of the myths now, um, like there was one started on one of the platforms last year that witches curse all the candy or whatever, and um, that they hand out and do just horrible things to promote unkind things to the family of children who come to their house and so forth. I mean, there's just the human mind is really good at creating some really horrible um, untruths sometimes about things. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. Um, I will say that as far as the thinning of the veil, um, paranormal activity becoming more prevalent this time of year, I believe that that does happen um, based on just things that I've seen and experienced in my own world. So I just, I, I think it's one of those things though where we're misinformed even about that because there's only been one incidence in the entire history of humanity that I know of where a ghost was responsible for unaliving anybody, and that was the Bell Witch story. So some of these stories of people uh, believing that ghosts can do serious damage to you and so forth, I think are like really over romanticized.
Now, speaking of paranormal,
Hmm.
you mentioned you've had experiences,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but you've had seen spirits walking around your house and shadow people and heard footsteps when no one's around.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, one of the earliest experiences I had was the night that my adopted mother passed. I was sitting in the living room and I was doing my homework at one of my aunt's houses, and she had a very big yard. And I just looked out this. She had a huge picture window, and I just looked out of it for no reason whatsoever. I just like turned my head to look, and off in the middle of this yard, and this was out in the country, um, there was this blue light that appeared, and I heard somebody whisper my name. And I didn't think anything about it. I just went back to work, to working on my schoolwork. And of course, later that day, the next day actually, I found out that my adopted mom, had passed that night. And what was very interesting about that was everything like her like the coffin, her clothing, everything was the same shade of blue that I saw that light as. Um, so I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, there was times when I remember my stepmother would tell me a lot of times she was like, I don't know what was going on in your room last night. I kept hearing people walking around. I thought it was people walking around. But I went in there and I opened the door and you were sound asleep and nobody was there. And, I just don't get it. And it was like, she was super religious on a very backwoods level. So she was always saying that, she was sure the devil was hiding everywhere in the house. But that was a ongoing experience. We had one of those, I wasn't born tomorrow, so I've got a few years on me now. The television I had in my room was one of those that the knob turned on it. We had three stations, four if you counted PBS. Um, and there was no remote. The knob would sit there and turn on its own and flip between stations from time to time and stuff like that. Um, I had one window in my room. It would open and close on its own, whatever at times. And I'd be like, okay, that's a little weird. Um, but it kind of became a normal occurrence for me. And then over the years, I lived not too far from the Hermitage at one point in the Nashville area. There was heavy activity all through that area, um, in and around Hermitage. I lived less than a mile away from it. The house that I lived in, there was always, I remember in specifically this one apparition. I really couldn't see physically, but I could see it in my mind. And I knew when she was there. and it was this little girl, and she would stand at the top of the steps going down into the basement, and she would peek around the corner of it in the of the door, and was kind of like she was playing peekaboo all the time with me. Um, Another one that I found interesting was a young man who was around 19 when he passed. Uh, he would just, he literally hung out around my altar in my workspace all the time. And a friend of mine finally told me, he said, I think he's very interested in learning about what you do because he's never seen it. And he's heard about it, but he's never seen it before. And he just hangs out at your altar all the time. So yeah, there's been several experiences I've had over the years of spirits. I caught them on the EVPs and so forth before. I've caught them on the spirit box. They've answered questions for me before, sometimes in full sentences. Those are the moments where you really get excited whenever you start having an actual conversation where they're actually answering full sentence questions.
Now that brings me up to a really interesting question. There are so many paranormal shows out there. Do you think they're fake? Do you think they're real? What is your input on that?
You know, I have some not very popular opinions for both sides on that because I kind of stand in the middle ground. I believe there are some that are very, very obviously fake. Um, I think even some of the fake ones have had moments where they had some very real experiences and did not necessarily know how to deal with it. I also believe that there are some people who you, I mean, you got to understand with ghost hunters especially, that is a lucrative business now. People can make really good money on those shows, and some of those places that these guys go to now, like they charge anywhere from like $500 and up per person sometimes for people to go and spend the night in some of those places. Uh, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember exactly what the name of the one, but I know I have a couple of friends of mine who live in Alabama who we were talking about this on my show not too long ago. The amount of money it costs for them to go and visit some of these places to investigate at. So it's a very lucrative business. I believe that a lot of the places they go to, I know have a haunted history, but I also watch some of those things sometimes and I see things and I go, that did not happen. Or if it did happen, it something because a lot of times one of the telltale signs is that stuff happens off camera a lot, or it happens in a way where you can't fully see exactly what it was. You're given kind of a hint of what happened. And if somebody is being up and up, like they're going to turn on their live camera and you're going to experience it. A smart researcher is going to have multiple cameras pointed in different angles so that you can get a clear view of what's going on. That's my personal opinion. Uh, if they're in it for the scientific research and for evidence. So, yeah, I think there are some very good ghost hunters out there. Don't get me wrong. Some of them are on some of those shows. I do know that a lot of those shows, if they contract somebody onto them, they're all of the material that the person who they contract with then belongs to the show itself. It no longer belongs to the person. So there's a lot of things that make me go, maybe we need to revamp the politics of some of those shows a little bit. I don't know. I don't know. I just have different feelings about it, very mixed feelings about some of it. Um,
All right, let's talk a little bit about go spirits in this thing. Why do spirits stick around a lot of times? Why do they
there,
not want to, pass on to heaven and be happy? Why do they want to stick around and scare their family or not meaning to, but stick around?
there's almost as many different answers for that as there are people, because the individual experience is always going to be different, for different people. Some simply don't even know they're dead. I've experienced that before, where uh, this one spirit in particular that I ran into in the house that I was living in Hermitage, she did not know she was dead, and it was obvious because she would like literally, like, I would turn off water or whatever, and I would literally hear her in my head going, "Don't you see me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I see you, but the problem is that most people can't, and there's nothing you can do with this water right now because you're not here. You're here, but you're not." And I finally had to have the conversation with her. I don't know if she believed me or not, but, and I know it sounds crazy, but honestly, if you ever experience any of this, you'll understand. Um, there are some people that stay because they are deeply attached to something. Some people stay because they feel an obligation to protect others, to save others from the fate that they experienced. There are some who, uh, are just afraid to cross over. They don't know what's on the other side, and they don't know what to expect. And of course, when we live in a society where, you know, people believe they're punished and rewarded according to whatever standards after death, um, then we got a problem. People are afraid. They're like, even if they've lived a really good life, sometimes they're still like, I probably should have done this and that differently. Um, and children are very interesting. I think a lot of times they're very scared and confused, and they're not really sure what to do or how to handle it. Eventually, they discover, oh, this isn't so bad because I can do what I want and I can go where I want, and nobody's going to tell me otherwise. And hey, I can go to Disneyland today and do it for free, and I can even ride all the rides. Um, so children can be they're very tricky a lot of times. Some of them are, if they're really young, don't even have the concept of what death is, what passing is, what going from one space to another is, and they're just kind of hanging out, going, "What happened? Where is mommy and daddy, and why am I here? And more importantly, who are you, and are you going to help me or not?" So it can be very interesting when it gets into the what fors and how and why somebody has passed. One of the things I want to point out, though, and I have not mentioned this yet, with hauntings, there are literally two types of hauntings that are really important to understand. The one that we're talking about right now is an actual true haunting where you have a spirit, you have an apparition that is intelligently manifesting, intelligently interacting and engaging with its environment and so forth. But then there's another type of haunting that's a little bit mystifying to people, a little bit more mystifying, and that is residual hauntings. And what a residual haunting is kind of like a recording.
A memory.
Yeah, it's a memory. And I like to tell people it's kind of like, you know, uh, the universe decided, or this particular space recorded this sound or this visual experience. Even sometimes people see uh, people walking around or whatever uh, in places where haunted theaters, as people call them, residual laughter um, is one of the more common sounds that's heard. And those are not intelligent hauntings.
Sort of like an imprint.
Hmm.
Person decided this instance was good enough to imprint it into the world, and it stayed where it is.
Exactly. A lot of times this is in a situation where uh, it's high energy emotion. That's why theaters are really common to have residual hauntings. Um, Residual hauntings revolving around grief, uh, a lot of things like that, traumatic passing experience. If somebody was unalived by another person, for instance, you may hear residual screaming. Um, I know one place in Decatur, Illinois, that I went to, I heard, I could hear a residual sound of a body hitting the floor. And it sounded like a thump, like when somebody falls or whatever. And I was just like, I kind of like looked around to see if anybody else, because there were other people with me, if anybody else heard it. And the roommate that I had at the time was with me, and he looked at me, he goes, "Yeah, I heard it. I know what you're thinking." Uh, but yeah, it's those are kind of interesting, and it's kind of one of those things where you go, "Hmm, I wonder what the physics of that is, what the natural law applies to when something is imprinted like that."
I mean, it's interesting in itself when you watch these shows and they go into places of high energy, especially places that have experienced traumatic events,
Mhm.
people being murdered, people dying in an accidental fire. I believe once they went to visit Abraham Lincoln. They went to the theater and they were able to pick up EVP. But what I find most interesting about everything is the EVPs. I mean, to be in even spirit boxes, they hear these spirits talking to you from the other side. To see them manipulate energy just to try to manifest.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the Lincolns. I'm just going to drop in there. The Lincolns were very active in the spiritualist movement. They had a child who passed, and both Mr. and Miss Lincoln, the president and his wife, became very obsessed about trying to make contact with their child from the other side. There's also people who, the stories of from the White House of uh, President Lincoln supposedly being seen in the White House a couple of times, his spirit, and so forth. So honestly, I grew up in Illinois. I've been to places that were historically known uh, to have been connected to President Lincoln, and there is a vibe there. Uh, the one thing in particular, there's the one house that I went to that supposedly is a replica of the house he grew up in on the spot he grew up in. Um, and there's a very heavy feeling in that house. Um, and I understand like the Lincolns went through, like they never quite got over the passing of their child. So I feel like uh, there was a lot. And then, of course, you can imagine, I can't even imagine. I don't even think I want to imagine what it was like for, Mrs. Lincoln to have lost a child and then lost a husband. That would have been definitely something that would have created a lot of uh, heavy energy in their lives. So it's very interesting. The spiritualist movement had a lot of very well-known people involved in it at one point or another. We just think of it as a group of weirdos getting together and doing a seance on Friday nights, but it was actually very trendy. It was people would hold very extravagant seance parties and so forth. So it even became a thing where the wealthy and elite would hold these seances and have just extravagant celebrations with it.
I know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I believe his wife was into the spiritualism.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we don't we we are all familiar with some of the stories like Rasputin and being heavily involved in Russian politics. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know is how deeply um, Putin is connected to the occult. He is rumored that he uses the guidance of um, witches and other people, practitioners of the occult, um, for guidance and so forth, and even ask them if he has permission to do like when he decided he was going to up the ante on changing the nuclear doctrine recently. He actually supposedly went to uh, some shaman and asked their permission to do it before he changed the doctrine. So a lot of people don't really understand the influence. The Reagans, the Reagans used astrology. It was very well known during the 80s that President Reagan had a personal astrologer.
It's funny that we talk about ghosts that you had mentioned not knowing they had passed.
Mhm.
Because about 2017, we had lost my father.
Mhm.
And my mom had a good friend who was a nun, but she was also a a medium, psychic
Mm.
medium. And so she said, I can talk to your husband, find out if he knows he's passed. Because that was one of my mom's issues is that my dad, he went quick. He was diagnosed in with cancer in July and passed away in August. And we wanted to make sure he knew that he had passed on. And she contacted my father, and yeah, he did. He knew he passed on, but he is still with us in spirit. He observes us. My mom and I tend to hear things at night every so often. We're seeing shadows of my dad walking around the house. We'll see one time the TV went on in the middle of the night. Um, Lights will flicker, doors will open. I mean, the best experience I remember was we were in the car and the radio was low, and the commercial came on for changing your air conditioning filters, and the volume went up.
Mhm.
Any of us touching it, and my mom and I just looked at each other like that's my father reminding us that we need to change the filter. So yeah, I mean, I've had little experiences with spirits. I remember laying in bed once and I see something at the foot of my bed and I couldn't figure it what it is out. I rub my eyes and then the next thing you know, they're gone.
Oh yeah, yeah. And it's very interesting that you talk about, like, I think one of the things that I find very interesting is family members, especially if it was the dad or the grandfather or whoever was the king of the castle at that point when they pass. um I've heard, like, I've talked to people who, one guy who I talked to, his dad had in his garage was his workspace, and it was immaculate, and everything had a place, and everything was in its place constantly. It was always clean. As soon as he got through with through doing whatever he did, it was time to bring out the rags and the cleaning solutions and start cleaning everything up, making it right again. And God forbid anybody go in there and touch anything and put it in the wrong place afterwards. Well, the dad passed, and the family was like, "What should we do with the garage now?" Well, his mom looked at him and said, "You're not going to do anything with the garage because your dad will have a fit." And he goes, "Mom, not, dad's gone." And she goes, "That's what you think." So go sit in his chair. And he kind of looked at her and she goes, "No, I'm serious. Go sit in his chair." And the dad had the one chair in the living room that he liked to sit in, especially when he was watching football. My friend said he went in there, he sat down in his chair, and two things happened. His dad loved popcorn, especially buttered popcorn. He said the first thing he got was a distinct smell of popcorn. And all of a sudden, he felt a tap on his head, which his dad would usually do every time he was like somebody was sitting in his chair and he wanted his chair. He would tap them, put his finger on their head and tap them, like, "Get up. I need you to get up." He said he literally jumped up out of the chair, ran back in there and goes, "That's not funny." And his mom goes, "Your dad was never a funny man. Do you think he's trying to be funny now?" They have yet to remove anything from that garage to this day.
Yeah, I mean, it's people don't realize that, and I've talked about this with my friends and everything. When you're younger, you look up at your parents like they're invulnerable. And then the
Mhm,
minute they get sick and then die, it's like your whole world just gets turned upside down. And my
mhm,
mother and I remember my brother was always the strong one in the family. My mother and I were more were were more believers in the afterlife and everything else. And my mom used to always say to me after my dad died, she's like, I'd sit there waiting for him to walk through the door because it felt like the first month or so, this felt like you were in a dream.
mhm,
Your body was in shock and your mind, you're just trying to process everything, and it's hard. And then you throw in spiritual interactions with my father. Always, my dad was like your friend's father. He loved tools. He loved computers. He was the type of person who would always tell me, when you put something down, make sure you pick it back up and put it back in its place. Because he
mhm,
was a locksmith, and he would tell me the story of how he used to leave his tools at his client's house because he would forget to put them back in his tool belt. And then he
mhm,
made it a point to always pick it up and put it back in his belt. And he would look at me and he's like, "You gotta remember to put things back in their place. That's how you lose them." My
mhm.
dad knew I was the type of person who would misplace things all the time. And to this day, since he's passed, anytime I misplace something, I'd always look and I go, Dad, are you playing a joke on me?
I can believe that. I can believe, yeah, because they still, I mean, people don't understand that when somebody passes, they haven't changed. Their personality doesn't change. They're still them. They're just them without the body. And I think it's one of those things where in our mind we expect for them to somehow change miraculously, to do something differently or to have different ideas and opinions. But my first question on that is, does the person who you're talking about, did they change their behavior and the way they thought and the way they acted if they wore a suit and tie opposed to wearing a t-shirt and jeans? And they were like, well, no. I'm like, so you give up the flesh suit, what would make you think they're going to be any different? They're not going to change their behavior. They're not, it doesn't change who they are. It changes the state of their existence. And that's kind of what this day is about too. Whenever I talk about people talking about accepting the passing over into the next cycle of life, and part of the human experience is, we are so accustomed to a flesh suit, that we think in terms of the physical all the time. But part of today is also about, remembering that at some point we too will go into will pass through the veil, and we will go into the next phase of our existence without a flesh suit. And we will continue to be exactly as we are now. And now, can they still learn things? Of course, they can learn things. Sometimes they learn some very crafty things in the process, such as how to hide stuff on you, or new tricks or new things, or they learn the idea of crossing over and what the experience is about. So, and they also sometimes have to learn to accept the fact that they don't have a flesh suit any longer. So, the learning process doesn't end, and essentially the life itself doesn't really end. We think of life as breathing in and out and blood pumping, but that's not necessarily what life is.
And on that note, I'll say thank you so much. It was a joy learning so much about the paranormal and Halloween. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Not a problem. And so I want to say, everybody, please make sure to subscribe and like. I'm Reed Miles. That was Daniel Cohoon, and I'll see you in the next one. And happy Halloween, everybody. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.